In the quaint, sleepy town of Riverdale, Charlie Green was a man whose life seemed perpetually caught in a storm of bad luck. At 35, he still lived in the same modest bungalow where he had grown up alongside his sharp-witted and ever-skeptical mother, Mrs. Martha Green. Charlie was known as the town dreamer, a man who spun grand plans but never seemed to get them off the ground. Despite his history of failure, Charlie clung to one enduring vision: building a potato export empire. He believed that Riverdale's rich soil produced the finest potatoes in the world and that his name could one day grace crates shipped to markets far and wide. It wasn't a practical plan, especially for a man with no money, no land, and no connections. But Charlie had never let practicality dampen his dreams. Each morning, Charlie would rise early, preparing his battered suitcase. Inside, he kept a notebook filled with scribbled ideas, a few brochures on farming techniques, and a single potato he considered lucky. He believed that this potato, a perfectly round specimen he had found during his brief stint as a farmhand, would one day symbolize his success. Riverdale's residents often shook their heads at Charlie's schemes. The shopkeepers who had long ago stopped extending him credit joked about his hopeless optimism. Yet, Charlie persevered, convinced that fate had something extraordinary in store for him. He only needed a chance to prove himself. It was on a dreary Tuesday morning, under a sky thick with ominous gray clouds, that Charlie decided to take a bold step. He would travel to the neighboring town of Millfield to register his business. He had no funds to actually start the operation, but registering the name, Green's Global Potatoes, would be the first step toward making his dream a reality. Clutching his suitcase and dressed in his only decent coat, Charlie boarded the rickety bus that served as Riverdale's connection to the outside world. The bus, a relic with peeling paint and a persistent rattle, was half empty. Charlie found a seat in the back, resting the suitcase on his lap as the vehicle lurched into motion. At one of the stops along the winding route, a man in an expensive suit hurriedly boarded the bus. His polished demeanor and sharp briefcase stood out among the more modest passengers. The man sat beside Charlie, placing his briefcase carefully at his feet. Charlie paid him little attention, his thoughts consumed by his dreams. As the bus rattled on, the man's phone rang. He answered in a language Charlie couldn't understand, his tone urgent and clipped. When the bus stopped again, the man abruptly stood and exited, taking Charlie's suitcase instead of his own. The exchange happened so quickly and quietly that Charlie didn't notice the mistake until much later. When Charlie arrived in Millfield, his excitement was palpable. He walked briskly to the government office, determined to make an impression. Sitting in the waiting area, he opened his suitcase to prepare his documents. What he found inside, however, left him frozen. Instead of his notebook and lucky potato, the suitcase contained neat bundles of cash and a small black book filled with cryptic codes. The money was unlike anything Charlie had ever seen, stacked tightly in rows and held together with rubber bands. His hands trembled as he stared at the contents, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Panic surged through him. This wasn't his suitcase, and whoever it belonged to would surely come looking for it. He thought about reporting the mix-up to the authorities, but fear of being accused of theft held him back. The sheer amount of money was overwhelming, and the notebook looked like it held secrets too dangerous to uncover. Charlie closed the suitcase quickly and looked around, his heart pounding. No one in the office seemed to notice his distress. He excused himself and hurried outside, clutching the suitcase as though it might explode. Charlie found a quiet bench near the edge of the park to collect his thoughts. He stared at the suitcase, his mind racing with conflicting emotions. The money inside could change his life. It could pay off his debts, fund his business, and finally prove to the world and to his mother that he wasn't just a hopeless dreamer. But the money wasn't his, and he couldn't ignore the danger it represented. Whoever had mistakenly taken his suitcase was likely already searching for it. The codes in the black notebook hinted at something far more sinister than a simple business transaction. Hours passed as Charlie wrestled with his conscience. Eventually, desperation won out. He decided he would borrow a small amount of the money, just enough to cover his debts and jumpstart his potato business. He would leave the rest untouched, returning the suitcase Once he was financially stable, it seemed like a harmless plan, but deep down, he knew he was taking a monumental risk. The next morning, Charlie returned to Riverdale feeling both anxious and exhilarated. Using a small portion of the cash, he paid off the debts he had accumulated at the local market. The shopkeepers who had grown used to his excuses were stunned by his sudden ability to settle his accounts. For the first time in years, they treated him with respect. Charlie also invested in a second-hand suit, a purchase that made him feel like a true businessman. Dressed in his new outfit, he met with a local supplier to discuss purchasing his first batch of potatoes. The supplier, impressed by Charlie's enthusiasm and apparent resources, agreed to a deal. Word spread quickly through Riverdale about Charlie's newfound success. Some marveled at his determination, while others suspected he had stumbled upon some unorthodox means of funding his venture. Charlie, oblivious to the growing rumors, poured all his energy into his plans. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was on the verge of achieving something great. As Charlie's life seemed to turn a corner, the men who had lost the suitcase were closing in. The owner of the money, a man known only as the accountant, was not one to let such a mistake slide. In his world, every dollar and every detail mattered, and losing the suitcase wasn't just a setback, it was a breach of his meticulously controlled operation. The accountant's men, dressed in their signature dark suits, had begun retracing the suitcase's journey. They interviewed the bus driver and passengers, piecing together the events of that fateful day. Their network extended far and wide, and Riverdale was no more than a blip on their radar. To them, Charlie was a nobody, an unfortunate blunder they needed to correct with brutal efficiency. Charlie, meanwhile, carried on oblivious to the tightening noose. The money had given him a taste of freedom and validation. He no longer felt the weight of his past failures. For the first time, people looked at him with admiration, or at least curiosity. He focused on his burgeoning potato business, unaware of the storm brewing around him. It wasn't long before the first signs of trouble appeared. At the market one afternoon, Charlie noticed two strangers lingering near the vegetable stalls. They were sharply dressed, their demeanor out of place in the otherwise humble marketplace. Though they didn't approach him, Charlie couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching him. That evening as he walked home, he had the eerie sensation of being followed. The streets of Riverdale, usually quiet and comforting, felt unusually threatening. Each shadow seemed to stretch a little too far, and every noise echoed louder than it should. By the time he reached his front door, his nerves were frayed. Mrs. Martha, waiting for him in the living room, immediately sensed something was wrong. Though Charlie brushed off her questions with a weak smile, his mind raced. The money, which had felt like a blessing, now seemed like a curse. But even then, he couldn't bring himself to abandon his plans. The following night, just as the town's streetlights flickered to life, Charlie heard a knock at the door. His heart leapt into his throat. It wasn't the time for visitors, and Mrs. Martha rarely entertained guests. He hesitated, his mind flashing back to the strangers at the market. Mrs. Martha, ever pragmatic, went to answer the door. Standing on the porch was a man Charlie didn't recognize. He was tall and lean, with a polished appearance that screamed money and danger. His eyes scanned the modest house before settling on Charlie, who had stepped into the hallway. Without stepping inside, the man asked for Charlie by name. His voice was calm, almost friendly, but it carried an undertone of menace that wasn't lost on either Charlie or his mother. The man left after exchanging a few pleasantries, but his presence lingered like a dark cloud over the household. That night, Charlie barely slept. He knew he needed to act, but he didn't know how. The suitcase was hidden in his closet, and he hadn't touched its contents since that first week. Returning it seemed impossible now, but keeping it felt like signing his own death warrant. As the days passed, curiosity got the better of Charlie. Unable to shake the feeling that the strangers were circling closer, he retrieved the small black notebook from the suitcase and began flipping through its pages. The symbols and codes meant nothing to him at first, but a few scribbled notes in the margins caught his attention. It became clear that this wasn't just about money. The notebook detailed transactions, names, and locations that hinted at a massive underground network. Each page felt heavier than the last, the weight of its implications pressing down on Charlie's chest. He realized the suitcase wasn't just a mistake, it was a liability that could put everyone he cared about in danger. For the first time, Charlie considered going to the police, but the thought of explaining how he'd come into possession of the suitcase, let alone what he'd done with the money, filled him with dread. He decided to wait, hoping against hope that he could find a way out of the mess without dragging himself and his mother into deeper trouble. Desperation led Charlie to Reverend Thomas, the town's trusted spiritual guide, and a man who had always shown him kindness. Charlie didn't reveal the full story but hinted at his predicament, describing it as a business deal gone wrong. The Reverend, sensing the weight of Charlie's burden, offered him advice grounded in morality and caution. That conversation planted a seed in Charlie's mind. He realized he needed a plan, not just to protect himself, but also to ensure his mother's safety. He began mapping out his next steps, starting with how to discreetly return the suitcase and its contents to its rightful owner. But deep down, he knew the journey ahead wouldn't be simple or safe. The strangers were watching, the money was dwindling, and time was running out. Charlie's once hopeful dream of a potato empire was now overshadowed by the cold reality of the danger he faced. Yet as always, he clung to a sliver of optimism, believing that if he could navigate this storm, brighter days might still lie ahead. Charlie's days in Riverdale became increasingly tense. The strangers in sharp suits, unmistakably out of place, began showing up in more corners of his world. One would linger near the market, another at the church steps. At times, they seemed to vanish entirely, only to reappear when he let his guard down. The anxiety of being watched transformed Charlie's once predictable routine into a game of evasion. He began taking different routes home, slipping through alleys and doubling back on his path. But no matter how careful he was, he felt their eyes cold and calculating, boring into him. The suitcase under his bed felt like a ticking time bomb, and every glance at it reminded him that he was running out of options. Mrs. Martha grew restless, sensing the change in her son's demeanor. Though he hadn't revealed the truth to her, his unease seeped into the house like a creeping fog. The once lively chatter over dinner had dwindled into silence, punctuated only by the occasional clink of a fork. Martha's suspicions grew stronger by the day. One evening, while tidying Charlie's room, Mrs. Martha stumbled upon the suitcase tucked under his bed. Its weight surprised her, and curiosity got the better of her. She flipped it open, expecting to find nothing more than papers and his lucky potato. Instead, her eyes landed on the remaining bundles of cash and the mysterious black notebook. She stood frozen for a moment, her thoughts racing. The money explained Charlie's recent spending spree, but the notebook, with its cryptic contents, sent a chill down her spine. Martha closed the suitcase carefully and placed it back where she had found it, her hands trembling. Whatever trouble Charlie had gotten himself into, it was worse than she had imagined. That night, Martha kept her silence, but her resolve hardened. She would protect her son, no matter the cost. While Charlie struggled to keep his life from unraveling, the accountant was growing increasingly impatient. Reports from his men indicated that the suitcase was still in Riverdale, its contents untouched apart from the missing cash. The accountant wasn't a man who tolerated incompetence, and his irritation was palpable. He issued new orders: recover the suitcase at any cost and send a message that would ensure such mistakes never happened again. His men, now under stricter deadlines, turned their focus entirely to Charlie. They knew his habits, his haunts, and his weaknesses. It was only a matter of time before they closed in. Unable to bear her mounting worry, Mrs. Martha finally confronted Charlie. She waited until he returned home from one of his increasingly rare trips to the market. Her stern gaze stopped him in his tracks as he stepped through the door. Without a word, she walked to his room, pulled out the suitcase, and placed it on the dining table. Charlie's face turned ashen. His carefully constructed facade crumbled in an instant. Though Martha didn't raise her voice, her disappointment cut through him like a knife. Charlie, unable to keep the truth bottled up any longer, poured out the entire story. He explained the mix-up on the bus, the temptation of the money, and the shadowy men who had been tailing him ever since. By the time he finished, he was trembling, his guilt laid bare before his mother. Martha listened intently, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she stood in silence for a moment before speaking. Though she was furious, her love for her son outweighed her anger. She resolved to help him fix the mess he had created, though her mind raced with the dangers they now faced. Martha's first instinct was to seek outside help. The Reverend Thomas came to mind, a man whose wisdom and discretion had earned him the respect of the entire town. The next morning, she dragged Charlie to the church, the suitcase wrapped tightly in an old blanket. When they arrived, the Reverend greeted them warmly, but his expression darkened as Martha explained their predicament. Though shocked, he agreed to help. He promised to contact someone he trusted in the Millfield police, someone who could ensure their safety, while resolving the matter quietly. Charlie felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. Perhaps there was a way out of this mess after all. But the Reverend's warning was clear. They would have to act quickly and cautiously. The men following Charlie wouldn't wait forever, and the accountant was unlikely to forgive even if the suitcase was returned. Reverend Thomas's contact, Detective Laura Sinclair, was a no-nonsense officer with a reputation for tackling organized crime. When she received the Reverend's call, she listened intently, her instincts telling her this was no ordinary case. She agreed to meet them in secret, arranging a discreet rendezvous at the church after sunset. That evening, Charlie, Martha, and the Reverend waited in tense silence until Sinclair arrived. She was sharp-eyed and confident, her presence immediately commanding respect. As Charlie nervously recounted his story, she took careful notes, her mind working through the implications of what she was hearing. Sinclair recognized the notebook for what it was, a detailed ledger of illegal operations likely tied to a powerful syndicate. She knew returning the suitcase wouldn't end the danger. The people behind it would want to eliminate any loose ends, and Charlie was now one of them. After examining the situation, Sinclair devised a plan. The suitcase would be used as bait to lure the accountant's men into a controlled environment where the police could arrest them. It was a risky strategy, but it was the only way to ensure Charlie and Martha's safety. Sinclair warned Charlie to stay under the radar while she arranged the operation. Any misstep could alert the accountant, derailing the plan before it even began. Charlie, though terrified, agreed to cooperate. He spent the next few days holed up at home, his nerves fraying with every passing hour. Despite their caution, the accountant was already a step ahead. One of his informants in Millfield had caught wind of the police's involvement, and the news reached him quickly. Furious, he ordered his men to accelerate their efforts. Charlie and his family were no longer just a nuisance. They were a liability that needed to be eliminated. The men in dark suits descended on Riverdale with renewed determination, their presence more threatening than ever. They began making their presence known, questioning shopkeepers and neighbors about Charlie's whereabouts. The once quiet town was now brimming with unease. As the plan neared its execution, tension reached its peak. Charlie barely slept, his dreams haunted by visions of the men in suits and the accountant's shadowy figure. Martha, though outwardly calm, spent her nights praying for their safety. Detective Sinclair and her team finalized the details, coordinating with local officers to set the trap. The suitcase would be handed over at a public location, with plainclothes officers stationed nearby to ensure a quick takedown. It was a gamble, but it was their best shot. The following morning, as the sun rose over Riverdale, the stage was set. Charlie and Martha prepared to face the consequences of their choices, uncertain of what lay ahead but determined to see it through. The public park in Millfield was chosen as the site for the handoff. Its open layout and steady flow of families and joggers provided the perfect cover for an operation that needed to stay discreet. Detective Sinclair's team arrived early, blending into the scenery. Some posed as couples strolling hand in hand, others as street vendors selling snacks, their real intentions hidden beneath casual appearances. Charlie was given strict instructions. He would carry the suitcase, acting naturally, and wait for the accountant's men to approach him. Martha, though she wanted to stay close to her son, was persuaded to remain at a safe distance, watching from a cafe window across the street. Reverend Thomas stood beside her, offering quiet reassurances that Charlie would come through unscathed. As the time of the exchange approached, the tension became almost unbearable. Charlie sat on a park bench, clutching the suitcase as though it contained his very soul. His eyes scanned the crowd, looking for the familiar dark suits. Every moment felt like an eternity, the weight of his choices pressing heavily on him. When the men finally appeared, it was as if the air itself shifted. They moved with a precision that sent a chill down Charlie's spine. Their eyes locked onto him immediately, their expressions unreadable, but their intent unmistakable. They approached in unison, their strides purposeful and measured. Charlie's heart pounded in his chest as they stopped a few feet away. Without hesitation, one of the men extended his hand, silently demanding the suitcase. Charlie hesitated, his fingers gripping the handle so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He knew this was the moment of truth. Detective Sinclair, watching from a distance, signaled her team to prepare. The officers subtly moved into position, their hands brushing the concealed weapons at their waists. Everything hinged on Charlie's next move. Just as Charlie began to hand over the suitcase, chaos erupted. A third man, one Charlie hadn't noticed, stepped out from behind a nearby tree, his hand reaching for something beneath his jacket. It wasn't part of the plan. Sinclair's team sprang into action, shouting commands as they moved in to intercept. The men in suits, realizing they had been ambushed, reacted swiftly. One grabbed Charlie, using him as a shield, while another tried to wrest the suitcase from his grip. The park descended into pandemonium as bystanders screamed and scattered, the serene morning shattered by the sudden violence. Charlie, paralyzed by fear, felt himself yanked back and forth like a rag doll. The suitcase, still clutched tightly in his hand, became the focal point of the struggle. He could hear Sinclair shouting orders, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade, but his world was a blur of motion and noise. In the midst of the chaos, Martha, watching from the cafe, could no longer sit idly by. Ignoring Reverend Thomas's protests, she dashed across the street, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. She had always been Charlie's protector, and she wasn't about to let him face this alone. As she reached the edge of the park, she saw one of the men dragging Charlie toward a waiting car. Without thinking, she grabbed a nearby trash can lid and hurled it at the man's head with surprising accuracy. The distraction was enough for Charlie to break free, stumbling backward into the arms of one of Sinclair's officers. The scene shifted rapidly after that. Sinclair's team moved in with precision, subduing the men in suits one by one. Within minutes, the park was under control, the suspects restrained, and the suitcase finally secured in Sinclair's custody. Charlie and Martha, shaken but unharmed, were escorted to safety. While Sinclair celebrated the success of the operation, the accountant, who had been monitoring the situation from a distance, quietly slipped away. He was a man who thrived on control, and this loss stung deeply. But he wasn't finished, not by a long shot. For him, the retrieval of the suitcase was just one battle in a much larger war. As he disappeared into the crowd, his mind raced with plans for retaliation. He couldn't afford to let loose ends remain, and Charlie Green had become a very loose end indeed. Back at the police station, Charlie and Martha sat in a small interview room, still processing the events of the day. Detective Sinclair entered, carrying the suitcase. She placed it on the table and opened it, revealing the remaining cash and the notebook. Sinclair explained that the notebook was a goldmine of information implicating the accountant in a vast network of illegal operations. With it, the police could dismantle his empire piece by piece, but she also warned them that this wasn't the end. The accountant wouldn't take this defeat lightly, and both Charlie and Martha would need protection. Charlie nodded numbly, the weight of his choices finally sinking in. What had started as a misguided attempt to chase his dreams had spiraled into a nightmare far beyond his control. Martha, ever the pillar of strength, placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, silently vowing to stand by him no matter what came next. To ensure their safety, Charlie and Martha were placed under police protection and relocated to a secure location in Millfield. The adjustment was jarring. The small, nondescript apartment felt like a prison compared to their cozy home in Riverdale. Charlie spent his days staring out the window, his mind replaying the events that had led them here. Martha, though outwardly calm, kept herself busy by organizing the apartment and cooking simple meals. She knew that dwelling on their circumstances wouldn't help, but even she couldn't ignore the lingering fear that the accountant might still find them. Back in his hidden lair, the accountant regrouped with his remaining men. The loss of the suitcase was a blow, but it wasn't the end. He had other resources, other ways to reclaim his dominance. His mind worked like a machine, analyzing every angle, every weakness in his enemies. Charlie Green, he decided, wasn't just an inconvenience. He was a symbol of failure, and the accountant didn't tolerate symbols like that. If the police thought they could protect him, they were sorely mistaken. The accountant's retaliation would be swift and brutal, designed to send a message that no one crossed him and lived to tell the tale. In the small, secure apartment where Charlie and Martha now lived, the days passed with a sense of unease. Charlie, racked with guilt and regret, spent hours pacing the floor, replaying every decision that had brought him to this point. Martha, ever the practical one, tried to focus on their immediate needs. She stocked the fridge with what little the police stipend allowed and made an effort to keep Charlie grounded. Outside their temporary refuge, the world moved on, but for them, time felt suspended. The presence of an officer stationed just outside their door offered little comfort. They knew that the accountant's reach extended far beyond Millfield, and the knowledge of his inevitable retaliation hung over them like a dark cloud. Detective Sinclair visited regularly, updating them on the progress of her investigation. The notebook, she explained, was proving to be an invaluable resource. It outlined the accountant's extensive network, naming key players' locations, and even detailing shipments tied to his money laundering empire. Each new discovery pushed the case closer to unraveling his operation, but Sinclair was careful to temper their expectations. Bringing someone like the accountant to justice wasn't a matter of days or weeks. It was a drawn-out battle, and the war was far from over. The accountant, meanwhile, had wasted no time regrouping. Though the notebook had been a significant loss, his ability to adapt and retaliate was what had kept him in power for so long. He mobilized his remaining assets, leveraging his network to track down Charlie and Martha. His plan was no longer about retrieving the suitcase or the ledger. It was about erasing the humiliation of being outmaneuvered by a small-town nobody. With cold precision, he orchestrated a series of distractions meant to pull the police's attention away from Charlie. Coordinated attacks on his rivals created chaos in Millfield's underworld, forcing Detective Sinclair's team to spread thin. In the midst of the confusion, the accountant's men closed in on the safe house, their intentions clear: eliminate Charlie Green and send a message to anyone foolish enough to challenge him. The night of the attack began like any other. The air was still, the faint hum of traffic from the nearby highway, the only sound that broke the silence. Inside the apartment, Charlie sat by the window, his thoughts a tangled web of fear and self-recrimination. Martha, ever watchful, sat at the kitchen table, knitting to keep her hands busy. Then came the sound, a faint creak of footsteps outside the door. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to put both Charlie and Martha on edge. Charlie motioned for her to stay quiet as he crept toward the window to peer outside. The officer stationed at their door was gone, his chair ominously empty. Before Charlie could react, the door burst open, splintering under the force of a booted kick. Two men in dark suits stormed in, their faces masked and their movements swift. One grabbed Charlie by the collar, while the other swept through the apartment, overturning furniture in a search for anything incriminating. Martha, unyielding even in the face of danger, grabbed the nearest object, a heavy ceramic bowl, and hurled it at the nearest intruder. The bowl shattered against his shoulder, staggering him for just a moment. It was enough for Charlie to break free, stumbling toward the kitchen where he grabbed a knife from the counter. The struggle in the apartment was brief, but chaotic. Charlie's desperate resistance, coupled with Martha's fearless improvisation, bought them just enough time for reinforcements to arrive. Detective Sinclair, alerted to the breach by a panicked call from the officer who had been ambushed outside, stormed in with her team. The two intruders were subdued after a brief but intense scuffle. Sinclair's fury was evident as she ordered them cuffed and dragged out of the apartment. Charlie and Martha, though unharmed, were visibly shaken. The incident had made one thing painfully clear: the accountant would stop at nothing to silence them. Sinclair apologized for the lapse in security, vowing that it wouldn't happen again. But her words did little to soothe the growing fear in Charlie's heart. The realization that they had narrowly escaped death left him feeling more trapped than ever. The attack marked a shift in Charlie's perspective. Until now, he had been consumed by fear, paralyzed by the enormity of the situation he had stumbled into. But seeing his mother's unwavering courage in the face of danger ignited something in him. He realized he couldn't continue to hide, waiting for the next attack. If he wanted to protect his mother and himself, he needed to take action. With Sinclair's guidance, Charlie began actively assisting the investigation. He shared every detail he could recall about the suitcase, the switch, and his encounters with the accountant's men. Though it felt small compared to the danger they faced, Charlie took solace in the fact that he was no longer just a victim. He was finally fighting back. Detective Sinclair devised a bold plan to draw the accountant out of hiding. Using information from the notebook, she staged a fake operation, planting false intelligence about a lucrative shipment that would force the accountant to personally oversee its recovery. It was a risky move, one that required precise timing and coordination. Charlie, though reluctant to be involved, understood the importance of the role he would play. The accountant's men were watching him, and his movements would be the bait to lure their target into the open. With Sinclair's assurances that the police would be ready to intervene, Charlie agreed to go along with the plan. The trap was set at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Millfield. The location, chosen for its isolation, provided the perfect stage for the operation. Charlie, carrying an empty suitcase meant to mimic the original, waited nervously as Sinclair's team took their positions. When the accountant finally arrived, flanked by a cadre of armed men, the atmosphere turned electric. Charlie felt his knees weaken as the imposing figure approached, his cold gaze locking onto him. But before the accountant could utter a word, Sinclair's team sprang into action. The ensuing confrontation was swift and brutal. The accountant's men fought fiercely, but they were no match for the well-prepared officers. Within minutes, the warehouse was secure, and the accountant, along with his remaining loyalists, was in custody. With the accountant behind bars and his operation dismantled, Charlie and Martha were finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. The police assured them that their cooperation had been instrumental in bringing down one of the most dangerous criminal syndicates in the region. Though the experience had left them scarred, they took comfort in knowing that justice had prevailed. In the weeks following the accountant's capture, Riverdale slowly returned to its tranquil rhythm. For Charlie and Martha, however, life had changed irrevocably. Though the threat was gone, the scars of their ordeal lingered. Charlie found himself restless, haunted by the events that had unfolded. He had narrowly escaped with his life, and now grappled with the question of what to do next. For the first time in years, Charlie looked at his dreams of a potato business with a sense of practicality. His aspirations, once fueled by blind optimism, now demanded careful planning and discipline. With the support of Martha, who had become his staunchest advocate, he began the slow process of laying a real foundation for his business. The first step was clearing his name in Riverdale. Rumors about his sudden rise and involvement with dangerous men had spread quickly, casting a shadow over him. Charlie decided to be honest with those who asked, explaining his entanglement with the accountant and his role in helping bring him down. Slowly, the community began to see him not as a hapless dreamer, but as someone who had faced incredible odds and emerged stronger. Detective Sinclair, impressed by Charlie's resilience and resourcefulness, introduced him to a government program supporting small businesses in rural areas. Through the program, Charlie gained access to grants and mentorship opportunities. For the first time, he had the financial and logistical backing to turn his potato empire into a reality. Martha played a crucial role in these early stages, handling negotiations and helping Charlie build connections with suppliers and distributors. Her no-nonsense approach balanced Charlie's enthusiasm, ensuring that every decision was carefully thought out. Together, they secured a deal with a local farming cooperative, which agreed to provide high-quality potatoes for his first shipment. The experience of working alongside his mother deepened Charlie's appreciation for her strength and wisdom. He often reflected on how her courage during their darkest moments had inspired him to keep moving forward. One of Charlie's biggest hurdles was facing the people of Riverdale, many of whom had doubted him for years. He decided to host a small event at the town square to formally launch his business. The gathering was modest but heartfelt, with rows of potato crates displayed proudly under a banner that read "Green's Potatoes, locally grown, globally bound." As Charlie spoke to the crowd, his voice trembled with emotion. He thanked the town for their patience and support, acknowledging the mistakes he had made along the way. He spoke candidly about the challenges he had faced and the lessons he had learned. By the time he finished, the crowd erupted into applause, their skepticism replaced by admiration. Martha watched from the front row, her eyes glistening with pride. For the first time in years, she saw her son not as a dreamer chasing the impossible, but as a man determined to carve out his place in the world. The day of the first shipment felt like a culmination of everything Charlie had worked for. A small truck emblazoned with the Green's Potatoes logo was loaded with crates bound for a regional distributor. As the truck pulled out of the driveway, Charlie felt a surge of pride and relief. He knew this was just the beginning. Building a business was a marathon, not a sprint, and there were countless challenges still ahead. But for the first time, Charlie felt equipped to face them. The ordeal with the accountant had taught him resilience and clarity of purpose, qualities he now carried into every decision he made. Months later, Charlie's business had grown steadily, with his potatoes making their way to markets across the region. Riverdale, once skeptical of his ambitions, now celebrated his success. The town's farmers saw him as a beacon of hope, proof that even the most unlikely dreams could come true with perseverance and support. Martha, though she often teased him about his rocky start, couldn't hide her pride. She had always believed in Charlie, even when his plans seemed destined for failure. Together, they had faced unimaginable challenges and emerged stronger, their bond unshakable. Charlie often reflected on the twists of fate that had brought him to this point. The suitcase, though it had nearly destroyed him, had also forced him to confront his flaws and discover his inner strength. He no longer believed in luck or destiny. He believed in hard work, courage, and the power of second chances. As the sun set over Riverdale one evening, Charlie stood by the fields, watching the golden light stretch across the horizon. In his hand, he held the potato that had once been his lucky charm. Smiling, he placed it gently into the soil, ready to grow something new.